Well, first of all, let me say I don't know, but then here's what I think. Uh, the model that I've always carried in my head is of a target, like a bullseye. And at the center of the bullseye is the dimethyltryptamine high-dose experience, which, you know, even though I've spent my whole career raving about how strange it is, I always hit low. I mean, it is beyond description. Language fails. Your language, my language, everybody's language. And as you move out from that, maybe the next circle out is high-dose ayahuasca followed by high-dose psilocybin, or maybe those two are reversed. And then further out, LSD. And then further out, things like 2CB. And then yet further out, things like ecstasy. And what's leaving the picture are, first of all, intense three-dimensional hallucinations, then intense two-dimensional hallucinations, and the more exotic transformations of the mental state. But I have the feeling that we're always aiming for the center of this mandala. Somebody else might have a different model of consciousness. Roland Fisher had a toroidal model and various states of arousal. But to my mind, if you raise the dose of any psychedelic, it becomes more and more like DMT. You have to take over 500 micrograms of LSD for it to be like DMT. Very few people these days do that much acid because it brings a lot of physical stuff with it. Ayahuasca at moderate doses is the classical hallucinogen of Amazonian shamanism that you've all read about. But double that dose, and it becomes indistinguishable from DMT. Same with psilocybin. If a 5-gram trip is a classic psilocybin trip, an 8-gram trip is like a DMT trip. So now some people are saying of alpha-salvinorin that it's much stronger than DMT. It's much more frightening and bizarre. Just to save my sanity, I choose not to believe that. Because I've been saying for years, if there's something stronger than that, I don't want to know about it. Because that definitely pushed me as far as I wanted to go. My son, I think, has more experience with all of this than anybody else I know. And I said to him, where would you put it? And he said, it's almost as strong as DMT. And so it's sort of like that. But then over this set of values and comparisons I've just made, you have to overlay the fact that like your blue eyes, your height, your body weight, your intelligence, and everything else about you that makes you unique, your inherited allotment of drug synapses is unique. And this is why some people are sensitive to drugs, some people insensitive, some people extremely sensitive. And one of the things about exploring consciousness with substances is you have to sort of learn what works for you. You may have gotten the idea from hanging out with the wrong people that the way you explore drugs is by doing as many as possible and in as many combinations as possible. I couldn't do that. I have never done that, and I can't do that. My body just can't take it. If I want a more intense drug experience, I take more of one drug. But part of exploring this area is to learn what works for you. For example, the most dramatic and easy to understand example, I think, is cannabis. Most people, after a preliminary brush with cannabis, which may last years, tend to decide that it somehow interferes, or that they have memory problems or feelings of social paranoia, and abandon it. Some small percentage of people experience no short-term memory loss and basically can't live without it. I speak from first-hand knowledge of this condition. So learning what works for you is very important, and then push that to its limits. What fascinates me, I'll just unload my personal opinion on you, are the tryptamine hallucinogens. I always found LSD too, what I call abrasively psychoanalytical. I don't want to endlessly reflect on my childhood upbringing and whether I'm a good or a bad person. I mean, I'll do a little bit of that, but I think I got that under control. I'm not interested in myself in quite the way some people are interested in themselves. What I'm interested in, and what's always been the holy grail for me, are visual hallucinations. And people have said you're a nut on this subject. But the reason I'm so into visual hallucinations is because when I'm seeing something that I could not previously have even imagined, then I am completely convinced I'm in the presence of an other, because I couldn't think that up, and yet I'm looking at it. Low doses of psychedelics, or moderate doses of psychedelics, transform the quality of thought. You think faster, think deeper, think odder, think broader, but you need more for that to burst through into hallucination. And that always has fascinated me it's just, I guess, in my personality. I was thinking some months ago about the books that have really influenced me in my life, and, we try to make a respectable list that makes us seem profound. So, Moby Dick, Finnegan's Wake, Whitehead, say, okay, that's the public list. What are the real books? Well, Bartholomew, Cubbins, and the 500 Hats, that was a biggie. But a really important book for me was a little book that Aldous Huxley wrote almost as a throwaway. I'm sure he barely gave it a thought. It's a book called The Art of Seeing. Seeing. And it basically, the message of this book can be given in one sentence. Pay attention to what your eyes are telling you. The eyes are it. And it's the visual thing that is so thrilling, so sexy, so infinitely deep. And in that book, Huxley tells you how to look at a painting by basically clear your mind, open your eyes, stand still. That's very important when viewing paintings. Stand still and let it come in. And then he gave advice. And, this is advice which I've seen acted out in both of my children. Incredibly simple advice in the world of child rearing, and incredibly important. And the advice was, draw from nature. Literally, with a pencil. Draw things. Because drawing things forces you to look at them. And don't draw from pictures. If you want to draw a bowl of fruit, get a bowl of fruit. And then what you look at is you see how, you say, oh, I see, when an object is red, its shadows are not black, its shadows are deep pink. And when an object has this curvature, then it spreads light around itself like this. And as you learn to look, this is a very impersonal process. You're not thinking about your childhood traumas or any of that stuff. you're really getting into the world, and this is how the world can communicate back to you. The world is something to look at, and that attitude in the presence of psychedelics will throw open a cornucopia of riches to you. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I was just curious. You said what about?
Oh well, I mean, cannabis is in a different category. I mix cannabis with air, with light, with being awake, with being asleep. There was a period in my life when I used to awaken at 3 a.m. in order to smoke because I couldn't go from 11:30 to 6 without it. I mean, granted, I was in Asia and the rules were different. No, I don't know what life is like without cannabis. I hear there is such a thing. But, no, what I mean is, I know people who say, well, we had a really far-out time Saturday night. We did 120 milliliters of ketamine and followed it with ecstasy a half hour later, and then we broke out the nitrous, and somebody had a little 5-MeO with them, and then I say, how was it? They say, far out. And I don't doubt it for a minute. I think I don't want to go any place that I can't find my way back to, because I might want to show somebody. And, it's sort of like the multi-body problem in mathematics. You can calculate every point in a system if there are only two bodies, but you only have to add a third before it becomes beyond calculation. And drug synergies are an absolutely unexplored area. You cannot go to the medical literature and find any papers on what happens when you combine LSD with 2CB. There isn't such a paper on this planet. So if you're going to do that, just know that nobody has ever been there before. And I don't mean intellectually, I mean physiologically. I don't know very much about the death of this writer who calls himself D.M. Turner, but he did die. And his book, his best-known book, is a book that I felt was completely irresponsible because it advocated these multiple synergistic drug doses, stuff like I just said. 2CB plus ketamine plus nitrous plus E plus this plus that. That's not how I would do it. I say, single pure substances, and if you're unsatisfied with the experience, as Dr. Leary used to say, when in doubt, double the dose. But he didn't say, when in doubt, empty the medicine cabinet. Just double the dose. Thank you. And Tim was a pretty reckless and wild-ass kind of guy, so if he took that position, I think we don't have to be ashamed to line up behind that. Yeah. Ketamine. It has a lot of enthusiasts. First thing, the most effective way to do it is by injection. Automatically, this raises flags of alarm for me. I just somewhere picked up the idea that banging things is a bad idea. But let's move past that, because it can be snorted. And anyway, ketamine is what's called a dissociative anesthetic. It is not an alkaloid. It is a veterinary anesthetic. In other words, if you have a racehorse and you need to wrap its tendon or work on it in some way, this is the drug of choice. I cannot deny that the experiences that I had, and I only had 5, were very, very interesting. I always did it in the presence of a physician, and I always did quite, as I understand it, quite high doses. In other words, I did around 140 milliliters. Milliliters. One of the things about ketamine is it's active over a huge range. Some people who roll it into their lifestyle tend to do small doses, like 40, 50, 60. When used as an anesthetic in pediatric surgery and stuff like that, 600 milliliters IV push, that would be like being hit by a freight train moving at 10 times the speed of sound. You would never know what hit you. It's a kind, for me, I'm just speaking subjectively, it was a sort of empty space. It was a light-filled space, and the metaphor that came to me was, it's like a new skyscraper, and they don't have any tenants. So there are these endless hallways lit by fluorescent lights and wonderful water coolers every 300 feet, but there's nobody there. And I talked to Rupert about this because one of the things we've kicked around over the years is the idea that drugs are like morphogenetic fields. And so, for instance, when you take psilocybin, it takes you. And in a sense, you are participating in every psilocybin trip anybody ever had. And because it was taken for thousands of years by Mesoamerican shamans, it's been decorated by them, in a sense. It has their mark on it. And so the morphogenetic field is extremely stable. Nothing you can do in there. You may be able to carve your initials on a picnic table or something, but you're not going to be able to make major changes in that landscape. But suppose you're a drug chemist, and suppose you read one of Sasha's papers where he tosses out the thought that the O-methylation in the 4 position of the trimethoxy isomer of the this and that might be hallucinogenic, and you make it. Nobody has ever taken this drug. It's a synthetic drug. You have made it, and now you're going to take it. And in a sense, if you come down saying this was an incredibly beautiful visionary experience, the next person is very likely to have a beautiful visionary experience. If you come down saying it was nightmarish and I felt bugs crawling under my skin and stuff like this, what's happening is the morphogenetic field is crystallizing around this drug. And the feeling I had with ketamine was it's really pretty undefined territory. The one thing I learned from ketamine, and I actually have to give it credit for this, is I got so loaded on that stuff that I lost the concept loaded. And that's never happened to me before. I couldn't understand what was happening because I couldn't remember what being high is. And so here I am, and I sort of come into awareness, and I say, what is this? And then the answer is, who knows? Next question, who's asking? Answer, who knows? And so I just look at it for a while, and then suddenly, out of left field, this aha experience. I must be stoned. And then it's like everything crystallized. That's it! I'm a human being. I took a drug. I'm lying on the floor. This is a trip. He said, oh, this is a trip. Gotcha. Now I know what's happening. We're having a trip. Okay, let's have the trip. But until I got that sorted out, it was like the biggest, so I would not, I don't prefer it because part of my ethic, I guess you would say, is that you should be able to communicate your experiences. It's almost like an obligation. It's like if you go fishing on our lake, you should give some of the fish to the village. If you go fishing and catch a lot of fish and eat them out in the boat and come back with nothing but bones for the village, then this is kind of bad behavior. So I stay clear of ketamine. I have a bias, it used to be stronger, against synthetic substances. But again, in fairness, I have to say, these drugs, people have different kinds of experiences. Like I've said to people on ketamine, you don't really hallucinate in the way that I want to hallucinate. People say, oh no, I had fantastic, it was beyond DMT. So again, the individual thing. And then what's the final thing? And then just physical things about ketamine. I don't like a drug so strong that the house could burn down around you and you would never bat an eye. And that could certainly happen on ketamine. At height, you have not a clue. They could remove your head and you would not bat an eye. And the other thing I noticed about ketamine is it really sticks to your ribs. In other words, the experience lasts an hour, you come down, but the next day you're driving on the freeway and comes a wave where you say, oh my God, what is this? And I think it sequesters in fatty tissue or something. And so that makes it a little dicey. Hope I didn't rain on anybody's parade here. The people who are into it are passionately into it. I accused one guy one time of being a monopharmaphile. I said, my God, you won't take a drink, you won't have a hit, you won't do... But this stuff, 5 times a day. Well, I'm as interested as you are. I don't have any special information. I did talk earlier in the weekend about this model of the hyperdimensional object intruding into three-dimensional space-time and through the miracle of metabolism, wrapping matter around itself for a few years, and then when the hyperdimensional form retracts out of this lower dimensional matrix, the matter that it's organized simply falls apart. I like that model. My DMT trips, as I think I mentioned this too, I've given it to some Tibetan guys, and they said, you can't go further than that and return. What he actually said was, it's the lesser lights. The lesser lights appear at the beginning of the bardo. The thing about DMT, and we didn't talk about it much this weekend, is that it is an inhabited space. A huge percentage of the people who take it encounter entities of some sort in there, not entities like wombats and foxes, but entities with intelligence of some sort, with language of some sort. Well, remember I talked about the principle of parsimony, of preferring the simplest explanation first. Well, when you have a drug which conveys you into an inhabited space, even the simplest explanation is going to be pretty baroque. Some people, including myself, wanted to leap to the conclusion, well, these must be the aliens. We finally found their hive. It isn't under the Atlantic Trench. It isn't inside Mount Everest. They're hiding inside this organic molecule. But I think in service of the principle of parsimony, preferring the simplest explanation, these things must be human souls. It's easier for me to believe in the human soul than to believe in a colony of extraterrestrials camped inside an alkaloid. But it's not that easy for me to believe in human souls. But still, the feeling you have from these things is one of immense affection for humanity. That wouldn't come from a diplomatic mission from Zenebel Ganubi. This intense love, and so I dare to hope, having deconditioned myself from my Catholic childhood and gone through existentialism and all that, now I dare to hope that maybe there is some kind of existence beyond the grave. One of the funny feelings, there are a number of, how could you call it, thematic layers in the DMT experience, but one of the thematic layers is, weird as this place is that you burst into, it's somebody very strange worked very hard to produce a place that they thought would be reassuring to a human being. And the analogy, it's stronger than an analogy. The feeling that comes through is, this is like a maternity ward. It's as though you're being born. And these marvelous, self-transforming, Fabergé, crystalline 4D toys that they're handing out in this space may be, to them, nothing more than the equivalent of those extruded plastic geometric shapes that we hang on a string over a bassinet. And if you ask a child psychologist, why do we do this? They say, well, it coordinates the child's ability to see spatial and so forth and so on. It's very like that. You have been born into an alien world, and the only thing you can do is gape, basically gape in utter amazement. And everyone is surrounding you, and they're saying, welcome, it's okay, be happy. Well, then if it is like a maternity ward, then one can know as much about whatever universe that is as one could deduce about this universe from looking at the four walls of a maternity ward in a small hospital in, say, Salinas. In other words, if you were to actually die rather than smoke DMT, then if we follow this model, then you would be in that place, but there would be no going back to this world after 5 minutes. Instead, there would be the next 5 minutes in that place, followed by the next 5 minutes. And I can tell within hours you would be beyond the reach of all anything you have ever called humanness or thought of. In other words, this isn't a world where one comes back and whispers in the ears of people and bangs doors in the middle of the night. It appears like once out of the body, this incredibly enfolded and compacted field called the soul begins to unfold into its death rite, I suppose you could say. And quickly one would become incomprehensible to this world, and all that is retained is the affection for us in our limited situation. Of course, thinking along these lines, I've looked at the literature of near-death experience. What those people are describing is something far more mundane than a DMT trip. Either they are dumbing down the DMT trip and suppressing the oddness of it, or they're having a quite different experience, because what's being said in the near-death thing, generally, is a tunnel, and then loving relatives, reassuring and familiar people. The DMT thing is a tunnel, but it isn't loving relatives waiting at the end. It's a welcoming committee of professional midwives. And they help you through. So I would suggest, without great heat, that if we want to study the near-death and after-death experience, that actually you come far closer to dying, whatever that means, on DMT than you do in drownings and things like that. Well, any situation can be looked at from a point of view that reveals the whole fractal. In other words, what it's saying is experience is holographic on one level, but linearly sequential on another level. In a way, this leads into, or this is a continuation of this discussion of death, because if we leave off the historical modeling and turn toward the modeling of an individual life with the time wave, then again, there is a message of hope. It says the most novel and amazing thing that will ever happen to you is the last thing that will ever happen to you. And I would like to believe that. I would like to believe that we gather our experience, we become wiser, we meet people, life becomes more novel, we have children, they have children, we have success, we have failure. Our life, you just get, if you're living right, your life should just get more and more baroque, beautiful, complicated, mysterious, and then you die. And then it really gets interesting. That's what this all seems to want us to believe. Let's put it that way. This is and then people say, well then if the world is fractal, then is it not true that the evolution of an individual could be extrapolated to be the evolution of the whole system? And then that leads to the mildly unsettling possibility that what this great transition we're moving toward is not T1 for everybody, but D1 for everybody. In other words, death. Death is the thing that really stirs us. We don't know what it is. We don't know whether we're supposed to flee from it or race toward it.